I'm the head of special collections and archives here at the University of Idaho, and we are very pleased to be collaborating with the Latah County Historical Society and the League of Women Voters of Moscow to bring Voices and Votes, Democracy in America here to Moscow. It's a Smithsonian traveling exhibit, part of the Museum on Main Street project. Those sorts of exhibits have been in Moscow before, but this is the first time we've been able to share it on the university campus, and it feels really exciting as we're entering another election season to have an exhibit about democracy here for our students on campus and our entire Moscow community. So today we have a Constitution Day presentation, and my colleague from the Historical Society, Caitlin, is going to introduce our speaker. But I just want to welcome you to the library space, remind you that this is a public space for all people, and so you can get a library card here at the library if you are a resident of the area. So we are the largest library in Idaho, and I encourage you to take advantage of the many resources that are available here, including after this presentation, if you haven't had a chance, checking out the Voices and Votes exhibit. All right, Caitlin.
Hello and welcome. As Dulcie said, my name is Caitlin Anderson, and I'm the museum curator at the Latah County Historical Society, and I'm also on the speaker series for the League of Women Voters. So today we are here to welcome Kylee. She's going to talk to us about the U.S. Constitution for very timely Constitution Day. So her presentation will talk about how the founders navigated fundamental disagreements about representation, federalism, and individual rights to create a workable framework for government. A little bit about Kylee. Kylee Britzman is an associate professor of political science at Lewis Clark State College. She moved to Moscow in 2018 after completing her PhD at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Champaign, thank you. Thank you.
We're thinking about politics.
Yes, I mean, the mindset. Her research focuses on voting behavior, political rhetoric, and social movement strategies. She serves as a president of the League of Women Voters, Moscow. So after her presentation, we'll have a little bit of time at the end to do a Q&A where you can ask her some questions, and then feel free to check out the Smithsonian exhibit, as Dulcie mentioned. There's the first section down here on the first floor, and then the rest is on the second floor. There's a lot of great information in there, so feel free to check that out. And without further ado, here's Kylee.
Thanks, Caitlin. Questions. Hi everyone, this is so fun for me. I live up here in Moscow but teach down at LCSC, and I am the president of League of Women Voters of Moscow, so it feels like all of those things coming together today to present here on Voices and Votes and celebrating Constitution Day, which is today. Many of the images and examples that I'll talk about today are directly from the Voices and Votes exhibit. So if you want to see, for example, some of the magazines or different photographs, they have those up in the exhibit. So I would encourage you to check those out. To start off with, I just want to talk about some recent things going on with voting changes and federalism here in the US before we get into the Constitution. So in the last few years, we've seen changes across multiple states in the Pacific Northwest in terms of voting. Since 2020 and the COVID-19 pandemic, Washington state has expanded their access to mail-in voting and also expanded the time of ballot collection. Sometimes we talk about election day, but in political science, we tend to think about it as election month. It's a weeks-long period of collecting ballots. Here in Idaho, there has been a maintenance of stricter absentee requirements, a strong encouragement of in-person voting, and changes in terms of the documentation that you need to vote. So we see expansion in one state, restrictions in another. We can compare that to Oregon, which has had all mail, so mailing in your ballots, elections since 1998. So 3 states, 3 very different ways of running elections, all claiming to protect election integrity and doing it in very different ways. And this is the central tension of federalism that we see over and over again when it comes to voting rights. The reality is all of these approaches work to a different extent, but depending on our perspectives and what we want to see in terms of access and protection, we probably see problems and issues that arise from these approaches. So we have 240 years of choosing workable solutions, of making changes along the way over the ideal and the perfect solution, which does not exist in any of these cases. So going back to the Constitution and talking about how we got to this document before going into voting rights, we can see the Constitution as multiple compromise attempts. So it's not just one compromise that occurred. What we have today was not the first attempt. There were multiple, I would say, failures, but we can really think of these as compromises, difficult decisions, and realizing what went wrong and trying to correct it. That taught them that compromise was necessary. We start with the Articles of Confederation, which often is a forgotten part of thinking about voting rights and the Constitution process. The Articles of Confederation really avoided any hard decisions. It left most rights up to the states. There was very little centralized government. It was more of like a treaty between the states than an actual constitution. Then we have the Constitutional Convention, which was facing these tough decisions and trying to figure out what the compromise would look like. Then we have a 2-year period of trying to sell those compromises to the public through the debates of ratification, and then the amendment process that we're in today, fixing what was left out in the original Constitution. So thinking of the Articles of Confederation as a failed compromise, again, this was an attempt to avoid difficult decisions. Within it, every state retained its own sovereignty and independence. So there was no resolution to that central tension that we have throughout the history since the Constitution between the states and the national government. They said it was a league of friendship, which sounds nice in theory, but couldn't actually function in practice. So there was really no working democracy at this point. Sometimes avoiding the difficult compromises can then lead to bigger problems down the road. And that's what we saw with the Articles of Confederation. So a convention is called to revise these articles. And really it became about not whether to strengthen the government, but how that would actually happen. And so the founders at the Constitutional Convention did not follow the plan that they had laid out in the articles, which was that you needed unanimous consent of the states to amend the articles. They did not have that unanimous consent. They decided to just scrap the whole document and start over. So there's already a breaking of the rules and this failed compromise right from the beginning, which led to the Constitutional Convention. So we get to this task in 1787. The challenge at this point is, how do you create a government that is strong enough to actually work and function in a way that it hasn't yet, but also weak enough that the states are going to be accepting of it, that the central government would not be too strong? With the failed Articles of Confederation, we were taking 13 states with different economies, different geographies, different interests, different groups of people, different demographics, and trying to create the centralized government. There's no successful model of a large-scale Republican government at this time, especially thinking about the geography and all of these different states. The founders have what they see as the philosophical ideal of a democracy. You have to put that aside to then build something that can actually be ratified by the states and be a governing document. So compromises happened on every aspect of the Constitution, and a big part of this is who gets to participate, which is what we'll be talking about today with voting. So the result is we have a working Constitution, but the questions of voting rights are left for future generations to figure out. There's very little mention in the Constitution. I'm going to talk about a few of the compromises that were made during the convention, and if people have questions or want to talk about this in more detail, I'm happy to in the Q&A. The framers, in setting out over the course of a summer, holding this convention, decided that they would start from what they saw as the easiest area of compromise and work their way to the hardest, with the idea that if they started where there was more agreement, there would be more buy-in to the process, so that by the end, when they got to the most difficult compromises, they would have already spent months together working on this Constitution, and they would again have that buy-in to then finish this document and work towards the ratification process. So one question is, how do the people choose? Democracy without direct choice. In each of these, I'll talk about what the dilemma is, what the reality is, and what happened. So a question is, do we have direct democracy, or do we figure out how to best balance the power between the large and the small states? Not surprisingly, if you're in a large state with a high number of people and a high population, you want your population to determine everything. That makes sense. Also makes sense if you're from a small state that you think you deserve equal influence and you don't want to be dominated by these larger states. In this case, thinking about the Electoral College, we see this compromise of a very convoluted, never to be replicated by any other democracy, Electoral College, and population matters, but not entirely. And the framers, like, this was a nobody's happy with the solution kind of thing. So it's built into this compromise that this is a difficult system where they're trying to balance those different interests and get something that works. That's not full direct democracy, but also not leaving it up to the legislature where we would have more of a parliamentary type system. So this is that compromise. The result, as we know, is a system where a president can win without actually winning the most votes. And we've seen this in 5 different elections where this has occurred. So in the introduction to the Voices and Votes exhibit, you'll see information about those discussions of how to choose what this system would look like. Next question is, who gets to participate? So thinking about property as a price to participation. The question here, and the compromise that has to be made, is how broadly should political power be distributed in this new nation? The states came to the table with very different ideas about what voter qualifications should look like at the national level. It was clear that there was not going to be a national standard for voting qualifications based on the discussions that were happening at the convention. So the compromise here was leave the voting requirements left up entirely to the states. So again, sometimes we think about it as like one election that's occurring. It's much better to think about it as terms of 3,500 countywide elections occurring simultaneously at the same time. So the result here after the convention is a patchwork system that we still have today with very different requirements and qualifications needed. And in this case, following the convention, 50 to 70% of free adult males, the vast majority being white, very, very few free Black males could vote at this time, which varied by state. And so we had a lot of differences in terms of that number based on the state that you were living in. The big question, the compromise they left for the end of the convention, was when we're talking about the people, who are we actually talking about? And this is representation without rights. The southern states wanted enslaved people counted for representation, but not for taxation. The contradiction here is, of course, glaring. Enslaved people, women, children, many others counted towards population, but couldn't actually vote. The compromise was to count each enslaved person as 3/5 for both representation and for taxation. This increased Southern power and was essentially the only way to get them to be willing to ratify the Constitution, while embedding representation without participation in our constitutional foundation, something that we are still debating today. We have Ben Franklin on the last day of the convention. He was the oldest person there. He was 81 years old during this summer of 1787. And he said, when you assemble a number of men to have the advantage of their joint wisdom, you inevitably assemble with those men all their prejudices, their passions, their errors of opinion, their local interests, and their selfish views. From such an assembly can a perfect production be expected. The wonder of it all, Franklin asserted, was that the delegates had managed to create a system of government approaching so near to perfection as it does. Franklin acknowledged that there were several parts of the Constitution which I do not at present approve, but he added, the older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment and pay more respect to the judgment of others. Franklin concluded by asking each of his fellow delegates to doubt a little of their own fallibility and step forward to sign the Constitution. And so he wanted to be clear that he was not happy with everything. Nobody left feeling like they got everything they wanted. They were enshrining that tension of federalism, of state versus national power into this document, but he also felt like they got about as close as they were going to, based on the conversations they were having, and felt much better after having the failed document of the Articles of Confederation, that they were leaving with something that they could ratify and that they would be able to persuade the public on. They left a lot of stuff out of this document. We have a really short constitution compared to most constitutions around the world. You see those little pocket constitutions being given out. There's a lot of information that's not in there, and of course it's also vague on purpose, and so I want to talk about a few of the strategic omissions, especially as it relates to voting rights, our topic for today. So there's some hard questions that were avoided at the convention. They did not go through every compromise they could have. There was nothing in the initial constitution about freedom of the press versus government stability. So civil liberties was a big point of contention amongst the framers, and that was not something that they were able to resolve at the convention. Slavery versus freedom. Some states at the time are moving towards emancipation. Others are embedding slavery into their government. Women's political participation versus holding these traditional roles. Federal versus state control over voting qualifications. So who is qualified to vote? The solution here is to leave this up for future generations to decide. So what this means is that the states are left to figure out voting qualifications. Citizenship is not defined in the original Constitution. I won't talk about citizenship too much today, but there is a whole part of the exhibit upstairs on this question of citizenship. Election authority is left deliberately vague between federal and state power, something that we still contend with today. And so the result is that 240 years later, we're debating this. You might be seeing all of the America 250 stuff coming up for next year. So that's from 1776 with the Declaration of Independence. We're in the late 1780s now, so we're in the 240 years later period with the Constitution. And all of these things are compromises of what is a living document. On that question of a living document and being able to make changes to it, we get Article 5 in the Constitution on amending the Constitution. And I like to point to this letter that Jefferson is writing in 1816 on that process of amending the Constitution, because we don't always talk about it when we talk about these different compromises. So he is writing that some men look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. They ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human, and suppose what they did to be beyond amendment. I knew that age well, I belonged to it and labored with it, but I know also that laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths disclosed, and manners and opinions change with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also and keep pace with the times. And his argument was that we should think about amending the Constitution every 19 to 20 years, a generational change of the Constitution. And so this was really about that living document aspect and continually revising, updating, seeing what worked, solving what didn't through the amendment process. So we have this mechanism for amending the Constitution through Article 5. We have 27 amendments to our Constitution. The first 10, of course, come soon after ratification with the Bill of Rights, solving many of those initial strategic omissions that were left out. They tend to come about not at regular intervals, but at points of crises. So if there is a moment right after a war, if it's a time of social upheaval, you'll see usually multiple amendments getting passed in quick succession, and then we'll go multiple decades without another amendment being passed. 27 amendments is very few compared to most constitutions, and we can really think of this as 17 following the Bill of Rights. The last amendment was in the early 1990s, so it has been a long time since we've seen an amendment, and I'll talk about this later once we go through the voting rights amendments. So going beyond the original Constitution, we see these moves towards expanding democracy, and like I said with amendments, they tend to happen at key crisis points when we see these. The founders' compromises in the original Constitution left massive gaps in multiple areas, but particularly in voting rights, which is really not part of the Constitution originally and was one of those strategic omissions. So these amendments have worked to fix what the original couldn't necessarily address. But every one of these amendments is also its own compromise. So I'm going to go through 4 of the voting rights amendments, each responding to the imperfect original, but also creating additional issues with the passage of each of these amendments. So following the Civil War, we see a group of amendments being passed, one being the 15th Amendment in 1870, so the right denied by race. Slavery has ended, but no voting rights exist for formerly enslaved people. The 15th Amendment is the right to vote cannot be denied because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Yet, we see that tension coming right back in this case with Southern states immediately using intimidation, violence, legal tricks to block access to voting for Black Americans. This is a federal law, the amendment, but we're relying on state enforcement. And that is another compromise of that federalism where we see the tension between the federal law that was passed, but often a lack of enforcement, especially among the Southern states. We then have the 19th Amendment, so this is coming right after World War I, 1920, the right denied by sex. So women have been active in democracy, but excluded from voting. This amendment was first introduced in Congress in 1878, where it languished for many decades. With the passage of the 19th Amendment, the right to vote cannot be denied because of sex, but this did not guarantee all women access. Black, Latina, Native American, and Asian American women still faced many barriers to voting, and we wouldn't see changes for many, many decades on these issues. So again, we get the amendment passed and ratified, but it doesn't solve all of the access issues. The 24th Amendment comes about in the 1960s. In 1964, the right denied by poverty. Poll taxes had been used since the late 1800s to keep Black Americans and poor whites from voting. You had to pay a fee before casting your ballot, essentially buying your vote. The 24th Amendment prohibited poll taxes in federal elections only. So 5 states kept poll taxes for state elections until 1966. And there are debates today about what is considered a poll tax. Do we still have poll taxes in certain cases where we're asking people for documentation that costs a certain amount of money to get, that is prohibitively difficult to attain? Are those instances of poll taxes? So the question still remains. The last major amendment that we have had came in 1971. Some people in political science would argue that this is the last big amendment we have because this is also when political polarization really starts in the era of modern politics that we're in right now. So this is in 1971, the right denied by age. This is the magazine from Newsweek that you can see up in the exhibit upstairs. 18-year-olds were being drafted for the Vietnam War, but couldn't vote for the leaders who were sending them. We see this rallying cry emerge during this time of old enough to fight, old enough to vote. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. This was the fastest ratification of any amendment. It took 100 days. So this is the quickest this has happened. On a side note, the 27th is the slowest. It was first introduced during the Constitutional Convention and passed in 1992. So took a long time for that one. The unfinished story. Each of these amendments expanded our democracy in different ways, but created new tensions. What remains constant is this federal versus state authority over voting. This has never been fully resolved, and we see this push and pull constantly. So the founders started choosing workable compromises over the perfect or ideal solution, and we're still making these same choices 240 years later. The big question when it comes to voting rights and the Constitution is, how do we balance having federal oversight with state control? There are some instances where people may want federal oversight because of what they see as these errors that are happening at the state level, or a lack of integrity, or a lack of access to voting, and then other instances where people don't want to have that federal oversight. This often depends on your political perspective and the question at hand. So it's not just a one-size-fits-all approach of federal authority and oversight versus the state control. I talked about 4 of the voting rights amendments, but there are still many modern barriers to the ballot here in the US. In terms of felon disenfranchisement, over 5 million Americans can't vote due to criminal convictions, and this varies dramatically by state. So there are 2 states where you can vote from prison and cast your ballot. There are other states where if you have a felony conviction, you will never be able to vote again. And this depends on the state that you're in. Thinking about representation in name only, going back to that question from the convention, states are able to calculate their prison population towards their population of their state, even if they are not from that state, they are being housed in the prison and they can't vote. So these questions about representation, participation, disenfranchisement, we see this today, and again, the results vary widely depending on the state you're in. For our territorial citizens, we have over 4 million people in US territories that cannot vote in our federal elections, but they can serve in the military and they do pay federal taxes. So this is another area of potential disenfranchisement for a group within our country. We also see these barriers to access with changes in voter ID requirements, limited early voting, polling places being closed, and all of these things disproportionately affect certain communities that have traditionally been barred from accessing voting here in the US. It's a pattern we see over and over. Each time there is a federal protection, it creates new exclusions, and then each expansion allows us to see new barriers that exist. And so it's, again, this constant push and pull of protect, expand, authority, oversight, this back and forth. The modern compromise area that we're in when it comes to voting rights is that states will claim that their measures protect election integrity. Critics will argue they disproportionately disenfranchise minorities and the poor. And so within each state, you'll see these debates and discussions and tensions playing out. We're seeing this right now with the proposed SAVE Act. So this has passed the House, but not the Senate currently, with that federal versus state control of elections. So these are just a few of the things that the SAVE Act proposes, not everything. Requiring proof of US citizenship to register for federal elections, mandating that states verify your citizenship status for current registered voters, and creating federal standards overriding the current state registration processes that have been put in place. The tension here is that federal authority, the argument at the federal level is that integrity of elections requires us to have national standards. States argue that they have been in charge of their elections since 1789, and this is the system that we have in place. And the same constitutional question that continued to divide the founders, where does federal power end and state sovereignty begin? And what that line is a constant tension when it comes to voting in this country. We might think there could be more amendments to voting rights. We've seen 4 major amendments that we've talked about today. There's a bit of a numbers problem here. So to pass an amendment, you would need 67 senators, 290 House members, and 38 state legislatures to propose and ratify an amendment. This is exceedingly difficult in today's era. It's hard at any time. We've had 12,000 proposed amendments in the US, and we have 27. So it is very, very hard to get an amendment passed. That's different than at the state level. We've had thousands of amendments added to state constitutions. Every state constitution in the US allows for amendments, and thousands have been added. So it's really different at the federal level than the state level when it comes to amending. We have never seen amendment by state convention and ratification. That hasn't happened. So there is a mechanism that the founders put in place that you could bypass Congress to amend the Constitution. We've never seen it happen. The closest it ever got, if anyone remembers this, in the 1980s with a balanced budget amendment, that was the closest that came, but didn't happen. Again, seems pretty unlikely in today's era that we would see this because of the political polarization at play. And so again, the last major change we saw to the Constitution was the 26th Amendment in 1971. So it has been a long time since we've seen a major amendment to the Constitution. That 27th Amendment that they proposed during the convention and that passed in 1992 is that members of Congress can't give themselves a raise until the next session. So not exactly one that has like stirred public sentiment in any way. Are there other mechanisms that we can use? This is what we see today. So part of the reason there's so much reliance on the Supreme Court and thinking about every national election as really as for president being, in some cases, more about the Supreme Court than who the president is going to be, is because that's where so much of the action is happening with these changes and deciding if things are constitutional or not. So the Supreme Court has quite an outsized role since the 1970s until today than we had seen previously, where the route would have been through Congress and state legislatures through the amendment process. Today we really see things playing out in our court system. And that's often why there's so much more tension today about who are the justices getting on the bench, what's moving through the court system, what's going up to the Supreme Court, because that's the mechanism where we're seeing these things play out. We're not seeing it through amendments to the Constitution. So you have to work within the constitutional constraints because of that lack of ability right now to amend the Constitution, because each election is so close. This is why sometimes it feels like every single election is like the election, because things are just so tight, they're so polarized, and that makes it impossible to get an amendment passed within the system. I told a few people I was doing a Constitution Day talk today, and they're like, ugh, does it even matter anymore? Like, come to the talk. I would argue it does still matter. I don't want to not acknowledge, though, the reality that in our current moment, many people understandably feel like our democratic institutions are failing. But you can also see, and going through the Voices and Votes exhibit, that Americans have felt this way before. And in fact, these are often the moments where you see those amendments getting passed, are in these moments of tension and social upheaval. Trust in our courts, in our elections, in Congress are all at historic lows. Again, making that amendment process less likely. So does this 240-year-old document still work? I would argue that the Constitution has survived for as long as it has because it was designed to be vague, imperfect, and adaptable. But that also means we will never not be debating what it means, what these tensions are, and what the next compromise might look like. Each one of these crisis points has forced the kinds of compromises that we've seen throughout this 240-year-old story. So why September 17th, Constitution Day? This is like a pretty recent holiday. This was established in 2004, so it has only been around for about 20 years. But it's September 17th because September 17th, 1787 is the day the delegates signed that imperfect document in Philadelphia. I think it's helpful to not see it as the end of these compromises, but the beginning of the ongoing experiment of not knowing how this was going to work, of putting the amendment process in because they knew that future generations would come along with different beliefs, ideas, and we would see changes to the Constitution. It was meant to be hard, but not impossible to change this document. So why we celebrate this date is to remember that our founders chose to act despite imperfection. They could have seen the Articles of Confederation as a failure and not known what the next step would be and trying to salvage that document versus starting over with the Constitution. I think it also helps us acknowledge that a constitutional democracy requires constant work of its citizens to recommit to that process of forming a more perfect union. And so my invitation is that Constitution Day shouldn't be about celebration of a finished document, of something that is no longer applicable to our lives, but rather about thinking of ourselves as joining this 240-year-old conversation about how do we live together democratically with a very imperfect living document. So today's voting right debates, we see them with legislation at the state level. We see local elections happening in our community this fall. We see things like the SAVE Act at the national level. These are our opportunities to participate in this founding vision of the Constitution, of this imperfect document. So with that, I'll close my talk and take any questions that you all have. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Kylie. So yeah, we're going to open up the Q&A portion. Oh.
Thanks, Kylie. That's going to be great coverage of a very complex topic. But I was hoping you might say something about the ERA and the process it has gone through all these many, many, many years.
Yes, so the Equal Rights Amendment, first put towards Congress in 1920. So we see it at the same time as the 19th Amendment, works its way through Congress until the 1970s when it seemed very close to being ratified. So you need 38 states to ratify, and it had 33. And they put a deadline on the ERA to get ratified. So they said you have 7 years to get this ratified at the state level. So it had been passed in Congress and then went to the state legislatures. Interesting that it had that timeline because I told you the 27th Amendment started in 1787 and passed in 1992. And there was no timeline on that. There hadn't been a timeline for any previous amendments. And so this started a legal battle of can you even put a timeline on amendments. There's nothing about that in Article 5, but Article 5 is like 6 sentences, so it doesn't give us a lot of information in general. And so it stalls, it doesn't meet that deadline. And then we see a resurgence in the last 10 years of states wanting to ratify the ERA and saying this deadline that was put on it wasn't legal in the first place, so we should still be able to ratify it. You also see states that have ratified it saying we would no longer like to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. I'm from South Dakota, that's what they did. We're in Idaho, that's what they did. So we see 5 states that say we would no longer like our ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. So you got to the 38 with the addition of Virginia, Nevada, Illinois, but then other states said they wanted to take it away. This is going through a lot of legal roadblocks. This one has been kind of the case study of all of this at play. That long period of time, that tension over the Equal Rights Amendment, people working very hard as activists and social movements for and against it, and it's kind of unclear what the solution is. So right now we don't have the Equal Rights Amendment. It's kind of working, like it's in multiple court cases right now, trying to figure out, can you actually have a deadline? What does it mean if states rescind their ratification? Can they do that? We have 38, but does that count because it's not within the deadline? So we're still seeing those court cases today with it. But it's a really complicated case, and kind of making those changes based on the whims of Congress and the states, right?
And what would it mean if it became a true amendment to the Constitution?
What changes would happen?
Yes.
I mean, that's a great question, and that's what many people have said, well, we don't need it because we already have these equal rights. Many states have passed their own version of the Equal Rights Amendment. So I talked about that states amend their constitutions much more frequently. Many states have added an ERA to their state constitutions. What would it look like in terms of substantive change? That's kind of the question with all of these amendments. Like, what does it actually mean to people's tangible lived experience to amend this? I don't necessarily know. There's a lot of arguments about what that would look like, but it's often hard to say, and then would introduce new complications as well. But yes, that started during the suffrage era, has continued on for 100 years, became very close to passing and was in that 1970s, kind of that last period of the amendment process that we saw. Yeah.
So I was wondering about, like, it seems to me the Constitution is like guardrails against a dictator.
Right, I mean, at this point, even the way it was written, even if we might have like a problem with the Second Amendment or whatever, but at this point, that document is a guardrail, right?
Yes, I mean, the biggest fear, especially at the convention and those changes from the Articles of Confederation, was they realized they needed more of a centralized government, but did not want to go too far because they didn't want anything that would start to resemble a monarchy. And so they were very, very fearful of what a powerful federal government would look like. And so what we see with the Constitution is trying to make sure there's enough federal oversight that this can be a country that can actually govern, but never so much power at the federal level. And of course, from Congress, we've seen that Congress has granted the president much more authority than the Constitution originally did. We've seen the interpretation of different legal precedents as giving the president more unilateral power than the Constitution ever did. So I think they would be quite surprised to see how powerful that position in particular has become. I think they would be happy to see that there's still that federal and state tension occurring, but I think the presidency in particular would be quite shocking to them, how powerful that has become through the courts, through interpretation, and through Congress granting presidents power. Because once you give one of the institutions more power, it is very, very hard to ever take that away from them.
Oh yeah, Kylee. Can you speak a little bit about where our indigenous sovereign nations fit into all of this push and pull between the states and the federal government?
Great question, yes. So we see many of these ideas at the Constitutional Convention about sovereignty coming from what the framers have seen of indigenous nations and governance and self-governance at this level. And so some of that philosophy is guided by it, but then of course, completely cutting off access to participating in the political system. And that lack of access, particularly to voting for Native Americans, and those questions of citizenship that I briefly mentioned, these don't even really start to even kind of get resolved until the 1960s. And so this takes an extremely long time of activism and also ignoring treaties that have been made, of not honoring the sovereignty of these nations. So like with many of these things, you have sort of, here's our idea of this, and then here is our practice of it. And that's taking power away, that's limiting access, that's not recognizing sovereignty, and really sort of keeping it out of that conversation as a whole. Yeah,
Hi, I just wanted to follow up on the issue about guardrails and executive power. There's a big debate in the constitutional expert community in the United States as to whether there is a crisis, constitutional crisis going on. And so I was wondering what your opinion was. I work on comparative politics, and I've been teaching comparative constitutions for a long time. And we talk about regime change in a democracy, about constitutional crisis, and about a significant constitutional change. And I was wondering what your view on regime change is, and are we in a crisis? Because that's what a crisis is, right?
Yeah.
And then, are we heading for a regime change, autocratic regime change?
That's a good question. Yes, Amy is the comparativist here.
I study autocracies.
Yes.
Which we're becoming.
Yes, so sometimes as political scientists, we're very good at depicting and analyzing what is happening in other democracies and not so good at looking inward at what's happening here in the US. I would say we are potentially heading for that regime change. I don't think we're there, but I do think we are in that moment of constitutional crisis. I think that fact that we really cannot amend the Constitution, and that these other mechanisms have given so much power to these institutions in a way that was not intended, and the ignorance of what is actually in the Constitution by many people in power, and sort of blatantly ignoring what has been set up as this system, is something that we haven't seen to this degree. So I would say crisis point, yes, we're in one of these crisis points. Are we in the full regime change to autocracy? No. Are we starting to go down the path? Yes, but can that be changed? I think so. Difficult, but yes.
Thank you. Sorry for giving you such a time.
No,
I just wanted to see what you
Hi, Kylie.
Hey.
I wanted to go back, you mentioned the lack of voting rights for people who live in U.S. territories. This is something that just really gets my goat, and I feel like it is one of the greatest hypocrisies of a democracy, that we have all of these residents, and nearly all people of color, who don't have a say in presidential election, and as you pointed out, are paying taxes. I'm wondering if you can just cover some of the debates about voting rights in the territories that have gone on, and what the current status is of that conversation.
Yeah, I think there's not uniformity of opinion within the territories either. So if we take Puerto Rico, for example, you'll see some Puerto Ricans who would argue that we should be a sovereign nation, and we don't want to be a territory of the US. We're not granted these rights. We are essentially second-class citizens. We have these representatives in Congress, but they are not able to vote. We don't have any real power. And so we would function much better as our own sovereign nation. Other people would debate that they should be included and have full access to these rights and be treated as full citizens of the United States, whether you're in a territory or not. And so you'll see, I think that's a lot of the push and pull that you see amongst politically engaged activists particularly. within these territories is like what is the right move. And another would be recognizing them as full states within the United States. So again, we often sometimes think like, well, we're at 50, we couldn't possibly add other states. Like, of course we have added states many times, right? Just as we have amended the Constitution. So I think we get in this mindset that how we're at now is just like how things are and have been, and that was the inevitable way we were going. But I think we could absolutely consider what statehood would look like for these territories as well. Or some would argue that wanting to remain in this status as being within the territory and also being granted these rights, that you at least minimally deserve, that you should be voting in federal elections and also have your representatives, like with Washington, D.C., not just be a person in Congress, but have those voting capabilities. So there's kind of the full spectrum of arguments, but I would say all of those are that we are being disenfranchised in multiple ways and do not have a say. And as you said, in our history of disenfranchising and marginalized people of color, this is yet another example of that with the territories and with felon disenfranchisement as well. This is largely affecting people of color.
Can I just follow up and ask what the debates are at the federal level, like amongst leaders? Like, aren't people even talking about it? I know when Obama was president, we did, but is it something?
They were definitely talking about it a lot more then. I think about 10 years ago, people were, you were like starting to see some real traction in a lot of these debates. I think the public was starting to learn a little bit more than they had previously. And I would say, although there are multiple representatives and senators talking about it and trying to bring it to the forefront, I think with everything else, like all the noise of everything, it's really been dampened to the detriment, I think, of these debates, especially amongst the public. There's very little public knowledge on this. Yeah.
Thanks for a great talk, Kylee. We hear a lot about the Constitution as a living document. We were speaking about the capacity for amending it. You shared slides about Jefferson's letter of 1816 saying this is, intended to be changed. Franklin said it's imperfect, get rid of some of your own biases and, recognize that somebody else in the room might have some smarts. What is the rationale among members of Congress for thinking the Constitution is infallible as the founders wrote it, and maybe allowing a few of those old amendments to stick, but not real willing to look at others? What's the argument? Certainly not to avoid chaos.
Good question. So this idea of originalism and this philosophy that we should see the Constitution as a document through the lens of what was intended, what was that original intent of the framers, trying to go into that mindset of figuring out that original intent, that really emerges in the 1980s. It's not until 1984 that people even start to use the term originalism. So again, something that we think about is like, this must be this long-standing philosophical legal theory, really emerges in the 80s in backlash to Roe v. Wade. That's where we really start to see this turn towards that original intent and that infallibility of the document, and that, yes, we've made these changes. They've tended to be progressive and expansion of rights for people. And Roe v. Wade, and the discussion of should that be added to the Constitution as an amendment really started these arguments about original intent. This is also when we see the Federalist Society develop and gain power. And so abortion and gun rights are where we start to see these arguments emerge. So it's not that these are legal theories that have been around for a long time. We start to see that shift in language about the Constitution in the 1980s. And again, we can think about that as the time of our modern era of polarization. So this is kind of new in a way. This looking at the Constitution as Antonin Scalia said, it's dead, dead, dead. It's a dead document, not living, not flexible, infallible. And so that's when that shift starts to take place, and we're just kind of seeing that gain more and more traction. First, it was kind of more among legal scholars, amongst justices, and then has gone into the public as well. We've really seen that idea take shape in the last 40 years.
Thanks so much, Kylie. The party in power in Idaho, one of their party planks is to revert, as I understand it, from direct election of our senators to legislative appointment of our senators. And I wonder what's the rationale behind that. Yeah, it's perplexing to me, the idea that we would take that away.
Yeah, so the direct election of our senators, that was an amendment. That was the 17th Amendment that put that in place. So we haven't always had direct election of senators here in the US. They were chosen by the state legislatures. And the Idaho Republican Party has that in their platform, that they would like to reverse that and go back to state legislatures choosing senators. And although I think with the Electoral College, there's some arguments that, you know, the framers were fearful of the people, they were worried about the decisions they would make. There's not a lot of evidence of that when it comes to the Constitutional Convention. I think there is in this case at the state level of that fear of direct democracy. And when you have that hold on that power, not wanting to give that up. And one way is to then be in control of state senators, and the Senate is an extremely powerful group of people. This is where we see much of the governing happening in Congress. And so I think it's in some ways astonishing, but in other ways perhaps not surprising, if you are the party with the supermajority in a state. I don't really know practically like what this would look like since that came about through the 17th Amendment, but interesting what people will pick and choose from the Constitution to serve their own purposes or not. Something we see politically all the time.
Okay, so I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up. And I'm sure Kylie may be around for a few minutes afterwards if you have any other lingering questions. So we just have time for one more question.
More than one.
Maybe two.
I would like to follow up on my neighbor Amy's question about a constitutional crisis and a slide into authoritarianism. In your field of study, Kylie, or in your own personal work, do you address, do you consider what the most effective ways are to resist that? Of course, a lot of us are thinking about that. And maybe to end on a positive note,
Yeah,
what do you see as potentially having a good effect, and what we can be involved in?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So my area within political science, if you want to talk regime change, you should. Amy is like a world-class expert on this topic, so you should definitely talk to her. The area that I study is political psychology, so I'm really interested in how ordinary people think about politics, so the non-political elites, all of us, how we think about the political system, and especially how we think about it when we feel very tested by what we're seeing, when we feel very frustrated and want to give up on what we're seeing, and how do some people stay motivated to be involved, while others, it is often much easier to just say, like, I can't deal with this, this is too much, I'm going to ignore this. And that makes perfect sense why people would do that. I think for me, and I mean, just thinking about this event and the league, the university, the historical society, for me, it's really been about being involved in the community. I think this is the first place I've lived where I've really felt like, okay, I'm putting down roots in this place, and I want to be really invested in what's happening. I want to know what's going on. I want to help make the changes that I want to see in the community through these different roles that I have. And so, like with city council, mayor, we have a contested cemetery board election happening this fall. It's like, I want to know who's running. What do these people do? What decisions do they get to make? And I think we can make so much of a change at the local level in things that really do affect our day-to-day lives in a way that at the national level, it can just feel very frustrating. And like we can't actually do anything about what's happening. And so I think events like this, I think we just live in a great community for local involvement, being part of these different nonprofits. That's really what keeps me going, motivated, excited, even hopeful about what the future might look like. So thank you for the question.
Awesome. Well, that was a very bright future to leave us on. So again, thank you to Kylee for talking to us today, and to the University Library, the Latah County Historical Society, and the League of Women Voters of Moscow for this event. And again, as we've all mentioned, there's the Smithsonian Voices of Votes, Democracy in America exhibit, where you can look more into some of these concepts that Kylee was talking about. And it's up until October 3rd, so feel free to check it out. You have a little bit of time left, so feel free to check it out. And again, thank you all for coming today.